this on. We're going to start talking about Chapter 3 today. We're going to talk a bit about how power is divided between the federal and the states today, and a bit about state versus federal issues, and kind of how that has been dealt with or not, as the case may be. Yeah, so if you have questions or you need me to repeat something, please just let me know. And for the students online, if you have questions, you can use the hand raising icon or the chat box. Okay. So what is federalism? It's basically the division of powers. It's how we divide up the power between our national government and the state government. And it's necessary because we have such a diverse population. With over 300 million people, multiple languages, multiple ethnicities, multiple needs, there's no way that a single unitary system would work for this country. We have to have it divided. Some countries, they're small enough that it's just a federal government, but we're too large to be spread out and too diverse for that to be realistically feasible. So we need a divided government to help with the important decisions. The state of California can't make decisions for the state of Texas and vice versa. So it makes sense that they'd have their own state governments. Is it a bit better? Trying to get the sound better for online. Okay, yeah. Joys of having to use a webcam. Okay. And the federal and state governments get their powers two ways. First, through what's called the express powers. And that's the powers given to them in the Constitution. The powers for the executive branch, or the legislative branch. The powers into the states through the 10th Amendment, for example. So these are the powers that are clearly outlined in the body of the Constitution itself. But the federal government also gets its powers through what's called implied or enumerated powers. And these come from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And essentially, what it does is it gives them the ability to use their power as necessary, for Congress to pass legislation as needed, for the states to be able to handle their own emergencies as much as they can. So part of it is specifically in the Constitution, and the other part of it is you can use this power as needed. Okay, so where Congress gets its powers is through the Necessary and Proper Clause, which essentially says that Congress shall make any decision or pass any law considered necessary and proper for the country to operate. So this is why Congress could pass the Patriot Act 2 weeks after 9/11, or create emergency disaster relief after a hurricane, or pass the stimulus bill to try and give us a little bit of money to spend during this pandemic. states get their powers through the 10th Amendment. Essentially, what the 10th Amendment says is any powers not reserved for the federal government are given to the states. So if there's a bit of a disagreement over who has control of what, states can argue if it's not in the Constitution, it's ours. We get to deal with this particular issue. And there is some power sharing. States and, of course, the federal government have police power. States can take action to regulate the safety and health of their citizens. They have state police officers, city police officers, to require people to wear a mask, for example, right now. Or if there's an outbreak like whooping cough in the valley a year ago, the state can take action to try and deal with that. So they have the power to regulate safety and health issues, to inspect food or to initiate a food recall if it's unsafe, to set their own speed limits on the roads, things like that. And they do share certain powers with the federal government. One of those powers is taxes. Most states have a state income tax. So if you live somewhere like Illinois, for example, you're paying the federal income tax and the state of Illinois. So you're actually getting taxed twice. You're paying income tax and you're paying for both state and federal Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Here in Texas, of course, we don't have a state income tax. But states also control sales tax, for example, or property tax. They also have the ability to charter a bank and to grant a business license. If a franchise wants to open a new location in Texas, they have to get permission from the state. So Tesla has been looking at opening a plant in Texas. In order to do that, they have to get the necessary licenses, regulations, inspections, and all of that from the state of Texas. Also, the gas tax. We pay a federal gas tax, but states can also set their own gas tax. So the federal gas tax is 18 cents a gallon. California passed a 12 cents a gallon gas tax on top of that. So they pay 30 cents a gallon in gas taxes. Okay, states have responsibilities towards one another. There are certain rules they're required to follow. And this is established in what's called the full faith and credit clause. The states have to honor the laws and regulations of other states. So for example, if you get married in Massachusetts and move to Texas, Texas is required to recognize that marriage is valid. For things like marriages, birth certificates, passports have to be recognized from one state to the next. Driver's licenses, right? If you're visiting Mexico and you use your driver's license, it has to be recognized as valid. So states have to recognize the laws and regulations of each other. But they're not always as good about that as they should be. And we've seen that quite a bit on the issue of marriage equality. Up until 1967, in some states, especially most of the South, interracial marriage was illegal. So a couple could be arrested for getting married in another state and then moving to a state where it was illegal. And this is what happened in the Loving case. Richard and Mildred Loving were an interracial couple who got married in Washington, D.C., where it was legal. They then went back to their home state of Virginia, where they were subsequently arrested in the middle of the night and charged with violating the state laws banning interracial marriage. They were forced to leave the state or face a prison sentence. So they sued. They said this is a violation of our rights, and they won. In 1967, the Supreme Court said interracial marriage has to be legal in all 50 states, and it has to be recognized as such. So you can't keep interracial couples from getting married. And there's a really good movie on the couple called Loving that looks at all the difficulties they faced during the case and the aftermath of what happened. It's very, very interesting. Another area that was problematic was same-sex marriage. Same-sex marriage was legal in the 90s in states like Hawaii. But in 1996, Congress passed the Defense of Marriage Act. And what this did was it said on the federal level, marriage is only recognized as being between a man and a woman. So even if a same-sex couple got married, their marriage would not be recognized in states where it was not legal, and they were not entitled to the same benefits as heterosexual couples. They couldn't get Social Security benefits from each other. They couldn't file their taxes together. They were charged more if they inherited their spouse's estate. And in some cases, legally, they weren't even allowed to be in the hospital room while their significant other was ill or probably dying. So, obviously, this is a violation of the full faith and credit clause, and there were two Supreme Court cases that tackled this issue. The first was U.S. v. Windsor. Edith Windsor and her wife had gotten married. Windsor's wife passed away and she inherited her estate. But she was charged on her taxes as not the surviving spouse, but basically any single person who inherits an estate. So she was charged a higher tax rate than she would have been if she had been married to a man. So she sued, and the Supreme Court struck down DOMA. They said it's a violation of full faith and credit. You cannot discriminate against same-sex couples on the federal level. And then, 2 years later, in Obergefell, the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage on the national level. Obergefell was actually 4 separate lawsuits against states that didn't allow for same-sex marriage. So since 2015, every state has to allow same-sex couples to get married, and they have to recognize same-sex marriages conducted in other states. So that's a pretty recent change, but an important one.
I know a lot of people who got married that year.
Yeah, and it doesn't require churches to marry same-sex couples like the Catholic Church won't. It just says that the state has to marry them. The state can't deny their marriage license, and they can't deny them if they want to get married in the courthouse. We actually had roommates who got married that year, same-sex marriage, yeah. They just changed the vows a little bit, no longer man and wife, but, spouse and spouse, and it's pretty much the same thing otherwise, yeah. It was also problematic because if a couple got married in Hawaii and then wanted to get divorced in Texas, well, their marriage wasn't recognized as legal in Texas, so either they had to go back to Hawaii or they had to figure out some way to make it work. They couldn't get divorced very easily either. Okay. States are also required to not discriminate against people from other states. For example, in jobs. This was a problem in the 1970s in Alaska. This huge amount of oil and natural gas in Alaska. And during the oil boom in the 1970s, a lot of people flocked to Alaska to make really good money really easily. So Alaska instituted a rule that they would give the jobs to state residents ahead of other people. And the Supreme Court said you can't do that. You can't say these jobs are reserved for residents of this state. For example, if there's a teaching opening in New Mexico, they can't say you're not from here, you can apply. They have to allow people to apply for jobs, licenses, and so on. They're also required by law to return a fugitive to the state they left. So if you rob a bank, you go to New Mexico is required to send you back to Texas. And there was an instance where a man had committed murder and fled to a state that didn't have the death penalty, hoping he could be tried there and spare the death penalty. And the Supreme Court said, you committed the crime in Oklahoma, you just have to take a chance at trial and hope you don't get the death penalty. You can't flee to a state that doesn't have the death penalty. You have to go to the state where you committed the crime. So every state has to agree to extradite a fugitive back to their home state. This can get tricky if it's an interstate crime or multiple state crimes. For example, there was a serial killer from Alaska named Israel Keys, who it's suspected he killed something like 30 people across the United States. And he'd killed a woman in Alaska and then driven basically across the U.S. to Texas using her stolen bank card. So he got picked up in Texas. And then the question was, do we send him to Alaska? Does it become a federal case? Because obviously he's crossed multiple state lines. They agreed to return him to Alaska to face trial there and then figure out what to do with him after that. And then he committed suicide, never even got to try him. But the idea is sometimes they'll go to one state and try them in another, or they'll make it federal, but they'll figure out what to do if it's an interstate, multiple state kind of crime thing. States can also enter into agreements with each other. The states that share the Mississippi River, they'll try to figure out who gets what part of the water. If there's an environmental issue, like the oil rig explosion in 2010 that hit Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas, the states will work together to deal with the environmental damage, with the cleanup together, and so on. They'll also enter into agreements on transportation. If you work in Washington, D.C., for example, it's very, very expensive to live there. So most people live in Maryland or Virginia. So they'll set up a train that runs from Maryland through D.C. and Virginia. And the states will control their portion of the train and work together to make sure it runs smoothly through each part of each state. There's also been an attempt by some states to tie the Electoral College to the popular vote. 10 states, plus Washington, D.C., have passed a law that says all of the Electoral College votes have to go to the winner of the popular vote to try and prevent what happened in 2016, where the winner of the popular vote was not the president. They need a lot more states, obviously, for that to become a possibility, but they're looking at it. They'd very much like it if they could make the Electoral College a little bit more accountable to the voters. All right, any questions before we move on? Okay, any questions online? All right, so in terms of how the federal government and the states kind of interact on the state level, local governments don't really exist in the Constitution. They don't have any status or protection. So essentially, it's up to the state to decide what type of local government, how many, and so on. So, for example, if here in Texas we have 3 communities, one with 2,000 people, one with 500, and one with 1,500, the state could force those 3 communities to share a government rather than have their own. So the state government can consolidate or dissolve the local government as needed. And what states will do in the larger cities, 5,000 people or more, is will give them the ability to use what's called home rule. So for example, a city like San Antonio can create its own type of government, can choose the mayor, the city council, and so on. So it gives local government control over local issues. If the government in Austin had to deal with the problem of water supply in Mexico, it'd take forever, right? I don't think they even remember we exist half the time, let alone provide services, right? So we need the local government to take care of the local issues, to deal with flooding or post-hurricane damage, and so on. There's also a bit of power sharing. Dual federalism helps keep the federal government from overriding the states, from passing laws that would be too hard on the states, becoming dictatorial. So because there's a lot of power sharing, the federal government can't just do whatever it wants to the states. States do have control of some areas like private property. Outside of eminent domain, there's really no federal laws regarding private property. So it's up to each state to decide what constitutes private property. Boundaries, for example, on land, stand your ground laws, posting of private property signs, things like that are left up to the states. And another issue that's left up to the states is the regulations of licenses. If you want to open a new business in Texas, you have to get a business license, a liquor license. If you want to practice medicine or law, you have to get a license. More often than not, if you're a lawyer moving from one state to another, you have to pass the state bar exam. So you want to practice law in Florida, you have to pass the Florida law bar exam. So they control who gets to open a business or practice medicine or law, franchises, things like that are all left up to the state. Also things like liquor laws, right? Here in Texas, liquor stores can't be open on Sundays, you can't sell hard liquor in grocery stores, whereas in California, you could go to a grocery store and buy a bottle of vodka and it's open pretty much every day of the week. So that's left up to the states as well. Okay, in terms of issues between federal and state government, Congress does have a lot of powers to regulate commerce, the power to declare war, to collect taxes. The Affordable Care Act is essentially a form of taxation, which is why Congress was allowed to pass that law. And very early on, it had to be established federal law was superior to state law. And so very early on in the Supreme Court, in McCulloch v. Maryland, the court was asked, does the federal government have the power to create a national bank? And the court said yes, that is one of their constitutional powers. They also established the supremacy clause. Federal law is superior to state law. If there's a dispute between state and federal law, usually federal law will win. They will strike down a state law that violates the Constitution or violates a Supreme Court decision. For example, some states that have tried to restrict abortion have found those restrictions being overturned in federal court because they're trying to circumvent Roe, and the court will say you can't violate federal law that way. There's also been some concern about interstate commerce. Interstate means basically across state lines. The federal government does have the right to regulate interstate commerce. And this is a result of the Gibbons case. The state of New York had offered a steamboat operator a monopoly on a route between New York and New Jersey. Because it was interstate, the Supreme Court said you can't do that, that's under federal jurisdiction. Had it been within the state of New York, it would have been fine. So interstate commerce is controlled by the federal government. Intrastate is controlled by the various states. So once you cross state lines, it becomes a federal issue. And there's always a lot of back and forth on issues with state rights. The Supreme Court kept striking down child labor law and workplace safety laws, saying that they weren't the purview of the federal government. And we'll come back to that in a minute. There's also been a dispute about gun laws. And by and large, the court said that gun laws are a state issue, not federal. So in U.S. v. Lopez, Congress tried to pass laws banning handguns within a certain distance of schools. And the Supreme Court said you can't do that, it has to be up to the states. So that's why in Texas you can conceal carry in a classroom, but in Florida you can't, because that's up to the state. In the Prince case, Congress mandated state and local background checks on handguns, and the Supreme Court struck that down as well. Each state gets to decide how much of a background check they're going to do, the waiting period for a gun, and so on. And so it gets into some issues of where do you draw the line between states' rights and protection? So I'm sure most of you have heard about gun violence in Chicago, right? They talk about Chicago has very strict gun laws, but they have a lot of gun violence. And that's partly true. Chicago has strict gun laws, but it only takes 30 minutes, depending on traffic, to go into South Bend, Indiana. Indiana gun laws are a lot more lax. So if you really want to buy a gun, you drive to Indiana, you purchase the handgun, and you bring it back. There's nothing stopping you from doing that, not really. And the only way you'd be able to tell if someone had bought a gun is if it's used in a crime, right, or for self-defense. That's one way people get around it. So just go across state lines, buy a gun where it's easier, bring it back. And part of it is also games, of course, we can't ignore that, but part of it is just it's that easy to go across state lines, or even just downstate and buy a gun somewhere where the laws aren't as strict.
So like on the black market, people sell stuff all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So getting back to labor laws and that issue. It wasn't until 1938 with the Fair Labor Standards Act that we got the 40-hour work week, that most child labor was eliminated, and that we got our first federal minimum wage. So we're talking 82 years that we've had these protections. And mostly because of the Great Depression that we actually got race standards. And there's been some incidences that pointed out the need for workplace safety. And one of the worst was in 1911 at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Are you familiar with this? A little bit? Okay. So the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory made shirts for women, and management didn't want the employees sneaking out to smoke or stealing press materials, so they would lock the doors. And one day a fire broke out in the factory, and the women couldn't get out. Very few people were actually able to escape. 146 people died. So I'm going to show you kind of what this looked like, because this was pretty brutal. 1911. Yep. Okay. So this is what the factory looked like after the fire. It was the deadliest workplace disaster until 9/11. So we're talking a pretty And then the other image I want to show you, which is slightly more graphic, but it kind of explains what we're talking about here. Women couldn't get out of the building, and so a lot of them jumped. And they tried to set up nets to catch the women, but with gravity, of course, that's not possible. And well, yeah, there's a lot of similarities, right? People having to jump out of the building. So a lot of the workers jumped because they thought maybe they could make it to safety, or the smoke inhalation was too severe. And these images were published in newspapers all across the United States. So people got to see the horrific aftermath of this. It was the first really published account of a horrific workplace disaster. And this is why we have a lot of the federal protections that we do. As a result of this fire, the management was actually put on trial for manslaughter. They were acquitted, but it was still something that they were put on trial. Companies were mandated not to lock the doors during the workday. Fire escapes became common, outside stairwells, fire extinguishers, all of that became common because of this particular incident. So it's unfortunate that it took something as awful as that, but sometimes that's how we get safer workplaces, is with horrible things like that. Okay, so we've seen the size of the government increasing and increasing and increasing. We've also seen a shift towards people wanting the state government to have more power. We trust our state government a little more than the federal. Not much, but a little bit more. But where we really saw the expansion of the federal government was during the Great Depression, when half of the workforce became essentially unemployed overnight. There was no way for the states to handle this. The high unemployment, the homelessness, the poverty. It became clear pretty quickly that the states were not going to be able to meet the needs of the citizens. And President Hoover rightly is criticized for not doing enough to deal with the Great Depression. He largely said that the economy will fix itself. The states have to take care of it. It's not up to the federal government. And by the time he realized actually the federal government needs to do something, he was toast. He pretty easily lost the election in 1932. So FDR comes to power and creates the biggest expansion of the federal government in modern history. With the New Deal, the creation of Social Security, unemployment benefits, insurance for deposits. Part of the reason people lost so much money in the Great Depression is the banks were using people's money to play in the stock market. When the stock market crashed, millions of people lost their savings. So the FDIC was created so that if a bank collapses, you don't lose your money. That there's some kind of federal protection so you're not completely wiped out if the bank goes under. Also, this was the creation of programs like the WA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, jobs created by the federal government to get people back to work. And so it became clear that during a major economic downturn, the states can't handle it on their own. The federal government is going to have to step in. The federal government bailing out the auto industry, the banks, and Wall Street after 2008. Congress passing the stimulus money because of the pandemic. All of this is the result of the work the Roosevelt administration did to give the federal government more power to deal with the economy. And it more than doubled the size of the federal government. It had to, right? Create all these new programs, you got to have more people to work in them. Also, just kind of a fun piece of trivia. In the Roosevelt administration, we had the first woman in a cabinet position, Frances Perkins, who was Secretary of Labor during the Roosevelt administration. So they did a lot of very historical things at their time. And a lot of the cooperation we see between the federal government and the states is because of the money that's given to the states. And a lot of the money is through three different types of grants. The first is called a grant and aid. This is where Congress gives the states money for a specific action or specific piece of legislation. So for example, school lunch programs are a grant and aid. They give money to the state of Texas. Texas has to spend it on school lunch programs. The same thing happened during the Eisenhower administration. The money to create the federal highway system was a grant and aid. The states had to spend it on creating their stretch of interstate. In the 1950s, we actually got the federal highway system connecting all of the roads. There's also what's called a categorical grant. Congress will decide what area the money is used for, but then the states get to decide within that area where they spend the money. So education is an example of this. Maybe the federal government gives Texas $20 billion for education, and $2 billion of it is a categorical grant. That $2 billion Texas can spend on whatever it wants in the area of education. So it can be new schools, technology, hiring more teachers, things like that. Medicaid was also a categorical grant, part of President Johnson's Great Society program, where he wanted to lower the illness and mortality rate for low-income Americans. So the federal government gave the states the money to create the state Medicaid programs and give poor people the attempt or the ability to get health care. Up until the 1960s, there was a high mortality rate in low-income areas, partly because of industries with pollution, lack of doctors, and so on. The idea was we're going to try to fix this as much as possible. And there's also project grants. These are where a state or local government will ask for funding for a particular project from a federal agency. So if the city of Weslaco, for example, wanted to apply for a grant for $5 million to improve technology in the classrooms, then it would be up to the city to propose a project and try to get funding from the federal government. There's a website, grants.gov, where the state, the local government, and even people can look for grants. There are some grants available for individuals, education grants to help pay for college, things like that. So it's a way of getting additional funding. It is competitive. You're competing against a lot of different organizations, and there are guidelines. You have to file reports saying here's what you're doing with the money, accountability, things like that. But it's another way for states and local governments to get more funding, especially very low-income areas. And also, you need someone on the team who knows how to write a grant, because it's a very specific skill. It's a very different set of writing compared to other proposals.
This is I have a question. It's
Sure.
not related to the class. So some of the kiddos, are we getting tickets outside? I forgot that we actually have to come to campus, so I don't even have a ticket.
Good question. I think because this is the first week face to face, I don't think you're giving out tickets this week. But you're gonna want to get a parking sticker as soon as you can. Yeah, yeah. But I don't think you're giving out tickets for like the first 2 weeks because I know students have to get stickers and all of that. So I think you should be fine. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have to remember to put my new faculty parking sticker on the other day. I was like, oh, whoops, yeah, I need to do that right away. Okay. We also tend to see a pretty cooperative relationship between the federal and state governments. The reality is that the federal government can't do everything all of the time. They need the states to take up their share of dealing with education, and healthcare, and so on. So there has to be cooperation between the federal government and the state and the local governments. They have to be able to work with each other to get things done. But it's not always been the best relationship. In the 1960s, the federal government had to force the states to comply with desegregation. President Eisenhower actually had the military take over the city of Little Rock to enforce the Brown decision in 1954. It was a pretty hostile relationship for a while. The federal government kept telling the South, you'll desegregate or we'll cut off your funding. So it got pretty contentious for a while. They had to force them to comply with federal law. Big resistance, and the courts kept telling the states, you have to comply with the law. So sometimes it gets a little complicated, a little testy. For example, right now, President Trump wants to send troops to Portland to deal with the protests, and the mayor is saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. So they're going back and forth. I think the last I read, President Trump called the mayor weak, and then the mayor said something resulting back, and so here we are. Yeah, you'd wish they could all act like adults, but unfortunately, that's not always the case. Usually it's cooperative though. The states do have to work with the federal government and vice versa. The Affordable Care Act, the states have to do their part with that. Medicaid, Medicare, public housing, things like that. So there is more of a relationship between the federal government and the states. And the metaphor they use to describe this is called the cake metaphor. So we used to be able to think of the layers of government as like a layer cake. The federal government was a layer of chocolate and the state was vanilla, right? You slice into it and you get both layers. I think it's more like a marble cake. The layers are mixed together. It's not so easy to distinguish between the two. And most of the time, if you need assistance with a program like food stamps or Medicare or Medicaid, the first line of contact is your city, right, and the state. It's not the federal government. You're not calling Washington, D.C., you're calling Mercedes or Austin at the most. But for the most part, the contact is with the state government, not necessarily the federal government. There's a lot of collaboration between the sides, some contentiousness that always exists, but by and large, it's a lot more intermingled, a lot more cooperative, and a lot more intermingled than it used to be. So for better or worse, all levels of government have to find a way to work with each other. And usually, we see the most cooperation after a natural disaster. after Hurricane Katrina, right, you had FEMA on the ground, President Bush going to visit, the National Guard, the Red Cross. You see the governor working with the president and FEMA to get the relief that they need for the people in their state. Out of curiosity, has anyone in this room besides me ever had to apply for FEMA relief after a natural disaster? Was it a fairly easy process, or?
I was not a lesson,
Yeah,
but they did, one of the helping us and, that letter.
good.
It
Yeah, good.
took a long time, it was a little bit difficult because by the time they asked for the photos, like all the water had gone down.
Of course.
Yeah, you see stains,
Yeah.
but they wanted like physical water, so it was frustrating that like for a little bit they were like, well, you need to produce the picture.
Yeah.
You hold your house.
Yeah, stage it somewhere. Yeah.
And it took a while, but they did help.
Yeah. Mine was after Hurricane Irma was supposed to hit Florida dead on while I was still living there. I got out. And it shifted, but the apartment I was living in, we lost power for 2 weeks. And so, of course, there's stuff that had to be replaced. We had to throw out all the food in our fridge. There's a little damage, so my roommate and I got a little bit of money from FEMA for that too. Like, yeah, replacing everything in our fridge is gonna suck. There's like no supplies and no food, so that was fun. Yeah. Okay, so just as a reminder, 3 weeks from today, on the 24th, your paper proposal is due in Blackboard. All I need from you on the 24th is what you're writing your paper on, why you chose that topic, and 2 potential sources. So the topic is up to you. Anything relating to federal government, it can be a Supreme Court case, a president, abortion, the death penalty, immigration, any topic you want. In terms of sources, don't use Wikipedia. Anyone can edit it, so it's not a valid source. But if you find a really good YouTube video, that's allowed. Try not to use personal blogs or websites, but any news, reputable news agency is fine. Books, articles, all of those are acceptable sources. You can use any citation style you like, MLA, APA, or Chicago. I know all three. I'm comfortable with all three. Whatever you're the most comfortable with, that's fine. It's not for credit, it's just so I can make sure you're not trying to do too much in a research paper. Like one semester, I had a student who wanted to write about 4 Supreme Court cases in 5 pages. That's not possible. So just to kind of help you stay on track with your research papers, and hopefully prevent you from writing it 2 days before it's due. Not that anyone ever does that, but just in case, that way you guys have an idea on the paper. After the 24th, if you want to change the topic, that's fine. Just let me know what you're going to change it to. I will open a box in Blackboard, or you can upload the paper proposal. I'll also give you an example of a proposal to look at. I'll also post later in the semester an example of a research paper done by a previous student that was like really good, so you can kind of see what they did. And then if you want me to take a look at like a rough draft of your paper, I can do that as well. So it's 5 pages, and the topic is up to you.
That's the minimum or the maximum?
The maximum is 5 pages, double spaced. Yeah. I mean, if you go a little over like 6 pages, that's fine. I just don't want 10.
25.
Yeah. And give me a 25-page paper, I might be like, yeah, it's very hard on a master's thesis, but. If you want to write a really long paper, my dissertation was 140 pages.
I hate that you're going to do it.
That's what we have to do if we want a PhD. Oh, yeah. Not at the time, but now, yes. Yes. Yeah. The time when like I'm going out of my fine.
Now you can do that.
Yeah, now I can be like, this is done, it's good. Okay. Any questions on the paper proposal or the research paper itself? No, everyone's good. Okay, any questions online? Okay. So next Tuesday, you guys will be online. We're going to wrap up chapter 3. We're going to have a discussion on marijuana laws, state versus federal issue on that. So for next Tuesday, if you can be online during class, great. If you can't, the lectures are up on YouTube. It takes a while for them to show up in Blackboard for me to upload, but I'll try to have them up by the end of the day. That way you guys have access to the lectures. Okay. Thank you.